Hi, my name is Ben Hales and this is the second part of an exclusive video series for tournamentpokeredge.com. In part 1 of the series, I looked at the mechanics of building an HM2 HUD. In this second part, I would like to turn my attention to the stats themselves and how to use them to benefit your game. By the end of this video, you will have learned what the most important stats are, what they mean, how to use them, and how to build a profile of your opponents. Before I begin, I want to point out that I mainly play 6-max tournaments and my HUD reflects this. If you prefer full ring tables, you'll definitely want to change some of the settings, which I'll try and give some guidance on as we go along. Look at the list of stats in my HUD here. I include the player name, which is optional on the HUD. It shouldn't really be necessary if your HUD is set up nicely, but for me it's a comfort factor. I want to be 100% certain the stats I'm looking at refer to the correct player, so I retain the player name on my HUD, which is denoted by the word text in the image window on the top left. To the right of that is the number of hands, which I'll click on now. I showed you how to set this up in part 1. With the shades of blue as the colour scheme. Technically, the number of hands is an important stat as it tells you the number of hands you've played with that player. If that number is less than 50, then you only really need to use the two core stats, VPIP and PFR. The VPIP stat appears on my HUD here, next to the number of hands on the top row. I've increased the font size for my top row stats so that they stand out. VPIP stands for voluntarily put money into pot. That means the number of hands a player puts money into a pot pre-flop, excluding blind postings, expressed as a percentage. This is incredibly valuable information. As a poker coach, I am constantly asking my students to tell me what their opponent's range of cards is, a question which many players don't have ingrained in their thought processes. Your opponent's VPIP stat will often give you a good indication of what that range is. If you don't know what a 10% range or a 20% range is, you should practice using an equity calculator like this one. This is a 10% range. If I increase this, you can see this is a 20% range, and so on and so forth. If you're not aware of these ranges, you really need to spend some time learning them. They're very important. Looking at my colour ranges for VPIP, you can see I have type players expressed as less than 15% VPIP in red. Normal players expressed as between 15 and 30% in orange, and loose players expressed as between 30 and 65% in green. Maniacs I have in pink. This is a sensible setup for 6-max tournaments, but if you are playing full ring tournaments, your boundary definitions should be tighter. Anything over 25% VPIP on a full ring table is already far too loose. When you're playing, you should be looking to take advantage of very tight players by stealing from them frequently, but folding when they show strength. Against really loose players, you can see cheap flops and look to exploit their post-flop weaknesses, or you can be patient and just play hands which will have them dominated. The VPIP stat will allow you to classify players fairly quickly, as it starts to become quite reliable after just 50 or 100 hands. For most of my stats, I have a minimum sample size of 5. If you're concerned about being misled by insufficient data, you should increase this number here. You can also leave it at 0 if this doesn't concern you at all and you want to build a picture of your opponents from hand 1. Before I look in detail at how to use VPIP, let's look at the pre-flop raise stat, as you're going to need to use these stats together. Using one without the other doesn't make any sense at all. As most of you will know, PFR stands for pre-flop raise, and as you can see I have my red, orange and green set to 10, 24 and 45. These again are for 6 max tournaments, and you might want to decrease the numbers to say 8, 22 and 35. You might not want the 4th colour too. Most people just run with 3 colours, but I do like the extra one, and don't forget a 5th colour is available if you want to complicate your scheme further. Let's now look at some different players' core stats in the replayer. My alias is Gam64, and you can see my VPIP is 29 and my PFR is 19. Although both these stats lie within acceptable boundaries for 6 max play, the VPIP in particular is quite high, indicating a strong desire to see flops with opponents and quite an aggressive pre-flop strategy. If you see a player at your table with core stats which are normal or close to normal, there are no immediately obvious ways of exploiting this player. I'll look at some more subtle ways of exploiting them later. If you look at the player called Suglin, you'll see I have a nice sample of 449 hands, and this player's VPIP is 58 and PFR is 1. This is huge information. You don't really need to know much else, as these two stats give you an amazing picture of your opponent. This player is a habitual limper into pots, raising almost never. If this player raises pre-flop, that is an alarm bell. Something out of the ordinary is happening, and that is often a sign of extreme strength in poker, so you should fold. When this player limps, you have great options. You know they are limping with a massive 58% range, including a few monster hands, so you could just sit back and wait for good hands in position to raise with. That certainly works as a winning strategy. But you could also decide to see flops cheap with this type of player. You can limp with them and bank on exploiting their post-flop weaknesses, which are often more severe than their pre-flop weaknesses. How the table is playing, stack sizes, situation in the tournament, behavior of the other active players in the hand, and your own playing style are all factors which will help you determine which strategy to choose from. This video is not about how to make pre-flop decisions, so I'm not going to labour this point, but you must always remember that no matter how powerful and attractive your HUD stats are, they are just one cog in the wheel, just one part of your decision-making process. In this particular example, I have an obvious squeeze push all-in, exploiting my opponent's tendency to limp too much pre-flop, which is bad play when players are sat short stacked. In general, with VPIP and pre-flop raise, you're looking for extremes, which is why color coding helps so much. The player in the top left-hand corner, Big Dodes, after a decent enough sample size of 141 hands, has a VPIP of 80% and a pre-flop raise of 30%. Both Suglin from the previous example and Big Dodes are extremely loose players, but Suglin was loose and passive, whereas this player is an aggressive maniac. He's probably a nice guy, but of course I'm using poker terminology. When you're exploiting Big Dodes, you need to differentiate carefully between pots he has limped into and pots he has raised. When he raises, we know he is raising with a 30% range, so you can respond normally when you have good enough hands. But you shouldn't change your strategy too much. However, when he limps, you know he has horrible hands, and you should raise liberally. It definitely helps when you're sat behind this player on the table. If you're sat in front of him, you don't want to be limping yourself into too many pots. Players with stats this loose are going to be making all kinds of different mistakes on the poker table, so over-analysing their play is often unproductive. It's enough to simply know that they are very loose. In this hand, Big Dodes calls a raise without value, and the button is able to commit to his ace-jack on the flop despite a relatively weak holding, because he knows how weak his opponent is likely to be. against a decent regular, his ace-jack would not be strong enough to commit to. Now let's look at a player with very tight core stats. Zeist and Sol sat on the small blind here, has a VPIP of 10 and a preflop raise of 8, and that's after a decent sample size. Players like this are predictable and easy to exploit by stealing from them at every opportunity, particularly in multi-table tournaments. He's generally going to fold to you pre-flop, and if he decides to play a hand, you have a great advantage knowing his narrow range. Make sure you know what an 8% raising range looks like, and think about how well your hand is going to perform against that range. Mostly you are going to be folding when he raises. Note also that if a player like Dr. Bones raises, his raising range at 7% is even tighter than Zeist and Sol's. This is a fact that can sometimes get missed, as you might perceive Dr. Bones to be much less tight due to his higher VPIP. It is important to view these two core stats together and understand exactly what they mean. I'm spending a lot of time on these two stats for good reason. You should be using them 10 times more often than any other stats. I've discussed how to exploit really tight and really loose players, but what about the vast majority of players who have normal VPIP and preflop raise stats? Let's look at my stats again, but this time using the pop-up boxes. If I bring up the preflop pop-up box by clicking on the VPIP stat, I see a gradual increase from early position, which is really mid position on a 6-max table, through to late position, indicating that I am positionally aware. This is one method of finding out a bit more detail about a player's ranges. I will be discussing exactly what these numbers should look like in the video on reports, so for now let's just be content defining a player as either positionally aware or not. If you play full ring games, this is even easier to spot, as sensible players will have super tight stats in early position. If we do the same thing now for the pre-flop raise stat, you can see 7, 11, 16, 22. My position has a huge impact on how likely I am to raise. So if you're playing against me, you need to assign a different pre-flop raise range for when I raise under the gun to when I raise on the button. You must not assume that 19 is my range at all times. Compare that with Kef 1980 on this table above me. After 309 hands, he's got almost exactly the same VPIP and pre-flop raise stats as I do, so he's just within the norms for 6-max play. But look what happens when we break it down by position. We can see that position has absolutely no bearing on this player's decision making. Not only does this tell us that we don't need to adjust his ranges based on his position, but it also tells us that he's likely to be making a lot of basic mistakes. Players who are positionally aware tend to be winning players, whereas those who aren't tend to lose money. As a result, you should be more inclined to get involved in a pot with a player who is not positionally aware. Even with this extra information, exploiting players whose core stats are normal is still difficult. My advice is to practice using the VPIP and pre-flop raise stats to build up a profile on your opponent and keep thinking in terms of ranges. If you know this is a weakness in your game, you should actively build it into your thought processes or book some coaching to help you. Before I move on to the second line of stats, let's just complete the top line. I didn't discuss the note caddy icon, which is the first item on the HUD here in the top left, and I'm not going to discuss any note caddy features in this video series. If you would like me to discuss note caddy, drop me a message, and if there's enough demand, I might tackle it at a later date. The other icon to its right is the auto rate icon. This uses the stats to automatically profile a player and assign a relevant icon which appears on your HUD. This is a really useful feature, so let's have a look at how it. If you scan around the 6 players on this table, you'll see 2 dice icons representing loose aggressive players, which is the category I fall into. There's 2 blue fish, 1 mouse, and 1 player who doesn't fit into any of the categories based on the rules, and there's just an asterisk in its place. Having a quick graphical image can be valuable whilst multitabling, as sometimes your brain processes the information faster through pictures. It's really important to understand how the auto rate feature works and how you can tweak it for yourself. If you go to the main menu in Holdem Manager 2 and click on the settings button here, you'll find the auto rate rules located here. There are 8 predefined categories of player, but you can complicate or simplify this as you desire. I'll talk you through these categories and how to exploit them. A rock is a tight player with a low VPIP. The main mistake they make is not playing enough hands in position, and then post-flop they're so aggressive that they sometimes get committed to hands they shouldn't. So you should steal from them liberally pre-flop and make a few speculative calls against their raises with hands that can do big damage in deep stack situations, the most obvious category being low pocket pairs. The blue fish and the green fish are essentially the same. The only difference is you have a small sample size for a green fish, so you can't be absolutely sure he's really a fish. You can see the auto rate rules for them here. These players are the easiest to exploit, as they make plenty of mistakes and often call without value. You should simply stick to playing good cards with them, avoid any type of bluffing, and increase your bet sizes when you're strong. The mouse is a loose passive player, which is pretty much the opposite of the classic tight aggressive model. Don't be fooled though. If the mouse has great post-flop skills, he can still survive on low limits. To exploit a mouse, you have to be prepared to push him around. Loose aggressive and tight aggressive strategies will both work well. Plenty of 3-betting and post-flop aggression is called for, and bluffing when appropriate. Loose aggressive and tight aggressive strategies, these are the players who are not easy to beat. There's no straightforward strategy for exploiting them. You should be looking to play in one of these 2 styles. Against tags, I try to bully them a little bit pre-flop when I can, and against lags, I really try and tighten up my game just a little in general. The aggro pre-flop player is very aggressive pre-flop and generally have a high PFR and 3-bet stats. Against this type of player, you're going to need to pick your spots. You'll often be put in very difficult positions and will need to be prepared to 4-bet and 5-bet from time to time. You can beat them with a normal tight aggressive strategy mixed with some well-timed re-steals. Finally, an ABC player is a player who plays standard poker. They can be exploited as their ranges and bet patterns are usually very predictable. Put pressure on them when you have position, they'll tend to fold when they're put in difficult spots. Adding new definitions to the auto rate rules here is fairly straightforward, using the add, remove and edit buttons here. If you run into trouble, you can reset the defaults here. If you do come across an unclassified player like the one Wolf BLR on this table, you can click on the auto rate icon and manually assign an icon. The reason that some players don't have their own icon is that they simply haven't fitted into any of the rules that are pre-existing. If you choose a coloured one like this, it creates a border around that player's HUD stats, which really makes it stand out. You might consider doing this for regulars on your table. Note that you can do this for any player, not just the unclassified ones. You just replace someone's existing icon. Moving on now to the second row of stats, you'll notice I start with the number of big blinds that a player is holding. When I'm multi-tabling, one of the first pre-flop questions I ask myself of each active opponent is, what's his stack size? How many big blinds has he got? I can of course work it out really quickly in my head, but these are vital split seconds. If you've got the information clearly on your HUD, you can save thinking time, which means you have more time to think through the other aspects of your decision-making process. Frankly, I'm surprised more people don't have this on their HUDs. Please watch out though that when playing live, the HUD will often be one hand behind, so if there was a huge swing in chips on the previous hand, the big blind stat could be inaccurate and mislead you. Notice I have color coded my big blind stats, so red is for players in push fold, yellow is for players in that so-called yellow zone of 10 to 20 big blinds, and then green is obviously for deeper stacks. For those of you who play turbo tournaments, this is particularly important as you're going to be playing a push-fold game very often. The following 5 stats on my second row deal with pre-flop information, and the 6 or 7 on the third row deal with post-flop information. Total 3-bet is an important stat which you can start to use once you've got about 1,000 hands on an opponent. It represents the percentage of times a player makes a pre-flop raise when he has the opportunity. I should say a pre-flop re-raise. I have a pre-flop re-raise of 6.4%, so my 3-bet stat appears as 6.4. It means that when I've got the opportunity, I'm going to re-raise 6.4 times out of 100. For low stakes 6 max games, I've got my red, orange and green boundaries set to 6 and 9 with an additional pink colour at 16. Players who 3-bet less than 6% of the time, especially those at less than 3%, are really easy to play against as they are never re-stealing. Their re-raise is nearly always genuine. So unless you're holding a monster, you can fold every time, safe in the knowledge that you've just dodged a bullet. If a player is re-raising more than 9% of the time, I'm going to be much more inclined to stay involved by calling or 4-betting. Once again, you're looking for the extremes and your color coding should fit that. If you play mid or high stakes, you're going to want higher boundaries because more 3 and 4 betting takes place on those levels. If a player 3-bets within the normal boundaries, you can't really learn a lot from the 3-bet stat. If you happen to have a large sample size on one opponent, you can click into the stat like we did with pre-flop raise and VPIP, click into the stat and you can see a breakdown of the various positions on the table and how likely that player is to 3-bet in that position. Some good and otherwise tight players will tend to be 3-betting quite light from the big blind in particular, especially if they suspect you are stealing. So keep an eye out for that information in the pop-up box. If you think he's re-stealing, you could try a 4-bet or see a flop in position. The following stat on my HUD is the fold to 3-bet stat, which is a stat you should look at whenever you are re-raising against regulars. Let's look at the boundaries for this one. Less than 50% I would classify as loose, and I use green for my loose colours. So I've reversed the traffic light scheme for this one. 65% in my opinion is about normal, so I've set the normal boundaries around this from 50 to 75. Anyone folding more than 75% of the time is being really quite nitty. Having said all of that, this stat in particular must not be looked at in isolation. The reason for this is that you're not analysing your opponent's first action in the pot, you're analysing his second action. So you need to be looking at both actions together. Let's take a look at some players' stats to show you what I mean. My own fold to 3-bet is, in isolation, pretty much perfect at 64%. But if you consider my VPIP and preflop raise stats are quite loose, my fold to 3-bet ought to be slightly higher than average. So I'm actually not entirely satisfied with this stat, and I'd like to increase it slightly. Now let's look at the player above me, 711, his stats. This is a nitty player in 6 max games with a VPIP of 17 and a preflop raise of 12. It's entirely logical that his fold to 3-bet percentage should be considerably less than mine. So the 53% we observe, though it looks to be very low, is probably only slightly less than what it should be. To my right sits Marino TM. His VPIP and PFR stats are entirely normal, so we'd expect his fold to 3-bet percentage to sit in the normal range. But look, it's really low at just 32%. This means we should avoid re-stealing against this player and stick to genuine re-raises, which is where we're likely to get paid off. Having said that, even after over 1,000 hands with this player, we only have a sample size of just 22, which if I click into this, you can see, okay, the fold to 3-bet stat, it's in green, and you might not be able to see in the brackets there, it says 22, which means there's 22 examples after 1,132 hands. It's not a massive amount of data, so how reliable this stat is really depends on your sample size. The next stat on my HUD is the total steal percentage, which means the percentage of time a player raises from late position in an unopened pot. Good players should be raising a high percentage of the time from these positions, as it is very profitable. On 6 max tables, this is especially important as the blinds come around much more often. I like to look at this statistic together with the PFR stat to get an idea of a player's positional awareness and to find out what sort of range of cards they are raising with in late position. I'll often use this statistic when considering whether or not to defend my blind. It's true that similar information can be got from the preflop pop-up box which I talked about earlier. There, you can see the positional breakdown of a player's preflop raises and get an overview of their likely steal ranges. The total steal percentage has the advantage that it is condensed into one easy-to-view stat on your HUD. I set my colour boundaries with a normal range of 20 to 35. My own steal percentage is 33%, and I'm probably missing plenty of opportunities when I'm multi-tabling, so this is definitely a stat where you want to be aiming high. For full ring, you'll need to lower the numbers a bit though. If I see a player's steal percentage in red, I know his raises are genuine and I should be less inclined to fight back. Whereas if a player is stealing more than 35% of the time, I'm going to pick my spots to re-raise. In this hand, I'm sat being attacked by a loose button raiser, small fry fish. I have the right situation and cards to re-raise. If you find a player is stealing a really high percentage of the time, you might need to find spots to re-steal as well as make genuine re-raises. My advice is if the opponent has normal stats but a very high steal percentage, he makes an ideal target for re-stealing with hands such as suited connectors. In this example, my opponent has very loose stats across the board, so I'm going to be much more patient and wait for spots like this one where he's likely to throw chips at me. Remember that a re-steal is a form of bluff, and it's always wrong to bluff into calling stations. The following two stats on my HUD are small blind fold to steal and big blind fold to steal. You might want to simply use one stat for this, the most obvious one being total fold to steal. These stats are all expressed as a percentage, and they show how often a player folds when facing a late position raiser. Another interesting stat which a lot of players use is the big blind fold to small blind steal, which is slightly more specific and therefore takes longer to build up a sample size for, but it does offer a lot of help when facing blind on blind action. The colour boundaries I have set up for small blind fold to steal, as you can see, have a normal percentage set at 78 to 90. It's usually going to be a bad idea to fight back from the worst position on the table when facing a raiser, so this number really ought to be quite high. For full ring games, these figures should be even higher. My big blind fold to steal normal boundaries are set a bit looser at 68 to 83%. One of my strengths as a player is my big blind defense, and I consider myself to be quite loose with a big blind fold to steal percentage of 70%. For most players, I would recommend keeping both of these stats fairly high, especially if you're not a confident post-flop player. The last thing you want to be doing is calling raises out of position without the right value. I recommend sticking to the plan of either folding or 3-betting, as calling is normally going to be wrong, except if you have a clear game plan of how to exploit your opponent post-flop. So once again, you're looking for extremes. When you see opponents with high fold to steal stats sat on the blinds like the two that you can see in front of you, you should literally be raising with any two cards from late position. It can be profitable even if you never invest any chips post-flop. If opponents are normal or slightly tight, you should be raising liberally from late position to steal blinds. Definitely include suited connector hands in your range. If your opponents have loose stats, like our friend Big Dodes here on the big blind, you should still be raising a high percentage of the time, but you might want to stick to a 25% range without the suited connectors. Stick to the high cards. The more likely your opponents are to defend their blinds, the tighter your range should be. But never forget that the button and cutoff are by far the most profitable places on the poker table, and most of you will not be raising enough when sat there. That completes my pre-flop stats. If I move on now to the post-flop stats on the bottom row, generally these are slightly more difficult to interpret than pre-flop stats, as they involve analysing an opponent's subsequent actions in a pot. You always have to use these post-flop stats in conjunction with the core stats in order to make sense of them. The first one is the flop C-bet stat, which is the percentage of time a player makes a continuation bet, or C-bet, on the flop, having made a pre-flop raise. Lots has been written about C-betting, and I'm going to try not to talk for too long on this. As you can see, my boundaries display normal C-betting as between 55 and 79%. Many of you may consider this to be too low, and that higher percentages should also be normal. But remember, we're trying to color code stats to capture extremes. I want anything that appears in red or green to be exploitable. I think that anyone C-betting more than 80% of the time is a prime candidate for getting raised a bit more often than normal post-flop. Quite often, I will raise and check raise opponents with high C-bet percentages because I don't believe they've hit the flop. An additional stat you might consider using for this situation is the fold flop C-bet to raise stat. I might also float the flop to see what they do on the turn. This is the downside to having a high C-bet percentage, especially on low and medium stakes, where you get plenty of people calling you down. My own C-bet percentage is too low, and I'm actively trying to increase it, but I think I'm always going to tend to have a lowish percentage as it suits my style of play. Players who have low C-bet percentages like me can be exploited, as often the post-flop action is a true indication of strength or weakness. you generally fold to the c-bet and attack when weakness is shown. Whenever you consider what a c-bet means, you also need to consider the player's core stats. Any really tight pre-flop raisers are generally going to be c-betting every flop, as they're only playing with monster hands, a super tight aggressive style. You don't want to be fighting back in these spots unless you have a good reason, like you flopped a set. Conversely, any really loose pre-flop raisers ought normally to be a bit more cautious about c-betting, so don't be surprised to see slightly lower percentages from them. Keep thinking in terms of ranges. What was his range pre-flop and what is his range now after his c-bet? If you look briefly at A Pirate in the top left hand corner here, he's got a decent set of core stats. This player c-bets 85% of the time. He's definitely a player who I would target for some bluff flop raises and check raises, as he's obviously bluffing at many flops and is a type player who will respect my raises. And that completes the second video in this series. In the third video, I'm going to be continuing right where I left off. My name's Ben Hales. You can see my details at tournamentpokeredge.com. Thank you for listening.